I will get around to seeing Ken Burns' series on the war in Vietnam sometime real soon. It'll be kind of a chore, though, something I'm really not looking forward to. That's because I've already heard that the Ken Burns documentary declares the war in Vietnam to have been a tragic mistake based on misunderstanding of something or somebody's by other somebody's. In a way, that's enough for me. I understand the war in Vietnam not as a tragic mistake, but as a vast and heinous crime, a crime wave, really, lasting 3 decades from 1945 to 1975. During the last third of that time alone, more than 3 million people lost their lives. The bloodletting began at the end of World War II. Ho Chi Minh and Vietnamese communists led the fight against the Japanese occupation forces and cooperated with U.S. and Allied war aims. The Vietnamese fully expected U.S. support for their independence from France after the war. Instead, the U.S. and British forces sent to Vietnam to accept the Japanese surrender reinstalled the French colonial regime. The Vietnamese fought a bloody 9-year war against a French colonial army entirely provisioned and supplied by the United States. When the Viets surrounded and defeated the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, President Eisenhower offered France nuclear weapons to break the siege, but the French wisely declined. Convinced that Uncle Ho, as the Vietnamese called him, and his party would win the 1956 elections, the U.S. created a brutal puppet government in the southern half of Vietnam to cancel the election and to request U.S. military aid against so-called invaders from so-called North Vietnam. In the final decade of the long Vietnamese War, more than 500,000 U.S. troops were deployed. More bombs were dropped than in all of World War II, and millions of civilians, mostly Vietnamese, perished. It's the final decade of this 30-year bloodbath that most now think of as the American War in Vietnam. Vietnam the mistake. Vietnam the tragic misunderstanding. Only it wasn't a mistake, and there was certainly no misunderstanding. The Vietnamese and other colonial subjects had been insisting upon their independence for decades. Ho Chi Minh showed up at Versailles back in 1919 when the terms of the treaty ending World War I were being drafted. Ho demanded independence for the African and Asian colonies of France, Britain, and other European powers. The Vietnamese knew from the very beginning what they wanted to do with their lives and resources in their country. The so-called misunderstanding was that the U.S. and political military establishment and 5 U.S. presidents over 30 years imagined they could torture, bomb, invade, and slaughter their way to some other outcome. Ultimately, they could not. 58,000 Americans and 3 million Asians perished. 3 million dead is not a mistake. It is a gigantic crime. After the World Wars, one of the 20th century's greatest. Crimes ought to at least be acknowledged and owned up to, if not punished. Pretty sure Ken Burns is not at all about that. At best, Burns seems to be about a species of healing and reconciliation that limits itself to Americans forgiving their trespasses against each other and excusing their trespasses against others, while dutifully acknowledging the valor of fighters on both sides. The series is not yet concluded, so we will have to wait and see whether Ken Burns ignores or buys into the discredited lie propagated by our country's war propaganda industry that unaccounted for American prisoners were somehow left behind and missing at the end of the Vietnam War. They weren't. But the little black flag and ceremonies for the imagined missing in Vietnam are standard now 4 decades after the war's end. I didn't go to Vietnam. Vietnam came to me, or tried to. I was lucky enough to live in a big city, Chicago, and to connect with the anti-war movement, which included black soldiers and Marines returning from Vietnam. Some of them frankly confessed to taking part in all sorts of atrocities and war crimes. We took them from black high school to high school in the fall and early winter of 1967 to repeat those confessions, and to tell other young black people like us that it was an unjust war which we had a duty to resist. I thought I was risking prison, like Muhammad Ali, when I sold Black Panther newspapers at the Armed Forces Induction Center on Van Buren Street and refused to be drafted. But by then, so many young people were resisting the war that Uncle Sam's draftee army became almost useless. In that era, there were not enough cells to lock us all up, and many white Americans were declaring themselves ready for revolution or something very much like it. U.S. policymakers learned that part of their lesson well. They ended the draft, and most anti-war white protesters went home. Noam Chomsky has it exactly right when he declares that Vietnam was not a mistake or a tragic error. It was an example that said to the world, this is what you get when you defy the wishes of the U.S. ruling elite. You get bombs, you get rivers of blood, and you get your country's economic potential set back half a century. Seen that way, Vietnam was not some tragedy the U.S. blundered into by mistake. It was an example and a crime. For that reason, it's going to be a chore and a bore at best to sit through Ken Burns' Vietnam documentary. Maybe I'll just watch Game of Thrones again instead. For Black Agenda Report, I'm Bruce Dixon. Find us on the web at www.blackagendareport.com.